During dinner service on a June evening in 1983, a few circuit breakers popped in the cockpit of an Air Canada DC-9 cruising high over Kentucky, a small annoyance, the kind of thing that happened now and then, nothing to interrupt the coffee for. Behind the wall of the rear lavatory, unseen and unsmelled, a fire had already begun to grow. 17 desperate minutes later, the airplane would be on the ground at Cincinnati, its crew having fought failing controls and blinding smoke to save everyone aboard. And then, in the 90 seconds it took to open the doors, the cabin would erupt into flame and take half the people in it. Among the dead was a folk singer whose songs a nation still sings. This is the tragedy of Air Canada Flight 797. There is no emergency a pilot fears more than fire. An engine can fail, and you fly on the other one. An instrument can lie, and you cross-check it against another. Even a loss of pressurization gives you oxygen and time. But fire is different. Fire is a countdown, spreads, it blinds, it poisons the air, and it eats the very airplane you are depending on to carry you to safety. And unlike almost every other emergency, it gets worse with every second you fail to put it out. On the evening of the 2nd of June, 1983, the crew of Air Canada Flight 797 met that most dreaded of emergencies in the worst possible form. A fire they could not see, could not reach, and could not identify, burning in the hidden spaces of an airplane that, like every airliner of its day, had been built with almost no thought given to what would happen if it caught fire in the sky. What happened over the next 20 minutes is a story of extraordinary airmanship and terrible bad luck, of a crew who did nearly everything right and were blamed anyway, and of a fire that turned survivable into fatal at the exact moment rescue was at hand. But it is also, in the end, one of the most consequential accidents in the history of commercial aviation, because the 23 people who died on that runway in Kentucky did not die in vain. They died in an airplane full of flammable plastic, with no smoke detector to warn the crew, no lights on the floor to guide passengers through the smoke, and seat cushions that fed the flames. And within a few years, because of them, none of that would ever be true again. The airplane was a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, a slim, reliable twin-jet with its two engines mounted at the tail, one of the workhorses of the short-haul world. This particular one, registered CFTL, was no longer young. It had rolled out of the factory in the spring of 1968 and had spent 15 years and nearly 37,000 flights hauling passengers around North America. It had led a hard life. In the year before the accident alone, some 76 maintenance write-ups had been logged against it, and 4 years earlier, on a flight out of Boston, the very same aircraft had suffered an explosive decompression that split open the rear of the fuselage and required Air Canada's mechanics to rebuild the tail section and splice or replace much of the wiring running through the back of the plane. The captain would later praise those mechanics for the job they had done. But the back of that airplane, the region around the rear lavatory where the fire would begin, was a place of much repaired, much handled wiring. And though investigators would search it exhaustively, they would never be able to say for certain what, in that tangle of old and spliced cables, first began to burn, to understand why Flight 797 became a catastrophe rather than a scare. You have to understand what an airliner cabin was in 1983, because it was, by the standards we take for granted today, a fire trap. The seat cushions were filled with ordinary polyurethane foam, which burns readily and gives off dense poisonous smoke. The wall and ceiling panels, the plastic trim, the carpeting, much of it was flammable, and much of it, when it burned, released a witch's brew of toxic gases, including hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide, that could kill a person long before the flames reached them. There were no smoke detectors in the lavatories, so a fire could smolder unseen in exactly the kind of enclosed space where fires most like to start. There were no automatic extinguishers in the waste bins. There were no lights along the floor to mark the path to the exits when smoke made the overhead signs invisible. And the crews were given only rudimentary training and equipment for fighting a fire in flight. None of this was seen as a scandal at the time. It was simply how airplanes were built. Flight 797 was about to reveal, in the most terrible way, how dangerous that complacency had become. The warning signs had in truth been accumulating for years. In-flight and post-crash fires had killed before, in accidents where the impact was survivable, but the fire that followed was not. And in the slow-dawning recognition among safety investigators that the cabin itself, the sealed tube of plastic and foam in which passengers rode, could become a death trap under the right conditions. The materials that lined airliners had been chosen for weight, cost, and durability, with flammability treated as an afterthought, and the regulatory standards that existed were weak and easily met. Safety advocates had been pressing for lavatory smoke detectors and less flammable interiors. And the idea was not new or radical. It was simply unfinished business, the kind of reform that everyone agreed was sensible and no one had yet been forced to enact. It would take a fire that killed 23 people in front of the cameras on a runway in Kentucky, with a national treasure among the dead, to convert that unfinished business into law. That is the uncomfortable pattern that runs through so much of aviation safety. The fix is often known long before the disaster that finally compels it. And Flight 797 is one of its starkest examples. In command that evening was Captain Donald Cameron, 51 years old, an Air Canada pilot since 1966 and a DC-9 captain for nearly a decade, with some 13,000 hours in his logbook. Beside him sat First Officer Claude Ouimet, 34, who had flown for the airline for a decade and had a few thousand hours on the DC-9 himself. Back in the cabin were 3 flight attendants, Judy Davidson, Lara Kayama, and the chief flight attendant, Sergio Benetti, who would, over the next 20 minutes, perform with a calm heroism that saved many lives and cost them nothing but the rest of their own peace of mind. Flight 797 had left Dallas that afternoon bound, by way of a scheduled stop in Toronto for Montreal. It was a quiet flight. Only 41 passengers had boarded, leaving the DC-9 less than half full. But the manifest carried an unusual weight of talent. Among the passengers riding home in the near-empty cabin was Stan Rogers, 33 years old, one of the most beloved folk singers Canada has ever produced. A big, warm-voiced man whose songs of sailors and settlers and the hard beauty of the Canadian landscape had become, in his short career, something close to a national inheritance. He was flying home from a folk festival in Texas. We will come back to him because his loss is inseparable from why this accident is remembered the way it is. But for now, he was just another passenger settling in for the long trip north, as the crew served dinner and the airplane droned east at 33,000 feet. It began so quietly that no one recognized it as a beginning at all. At around 10 minutes to 7 in the evening, as the cabin crew worked through the dinner service, the pilots heard a soft popping sound and noticed that 3 circuit breakers, the ones feeding the flush motor of the rear lavatory, had tripped. Cameron reached up and tried to reset them. They would not reset. He tried again a few minutes later, with the same result, and told Ouimet to note it in the maintenance log. And here is the thing that makes the opening of this story so quietly devastating. None of this alarmed anyone, because there was no reason it should have. Lavatory circuit breakers tripped from time to time on these airplanes. It was a known nuisance, not a known danger. The crew did exactly what any crew would have done. They logged it and went back to work. What they could not know was that, on the cockpit voice recorder, a microphone had already been picking up something they could not hear over the noise of the airplane. The crackling sound of electrical arcing, beginning several minutes before the breakers even tripped, and repeating each time the crew tried to reset them. Somewhere behind the rear lavatory wall, electricity was jumping where it should not have been, and heat was building where no one could see it. By the time the first human being noticed that something was wrong, the fire was already well established in the one place on the airplane best designed to hide it. That first warning came not from an instrument, but from a nose. At about 7 o'clock, a passenger in the very last row mentioned to flight attendant Judy Davidson that there was a strange smell at the back of the cabin. Davidson traced it to the aft lavatory and cracked the door open a few inches. Inside, she saw the small room filling with a light gray haze. Smoke but no flames. She called for help, and the chief flight attendant, Sergio Benetti, came back to look. Benetti opened the door and saw something more ominous. Not fire, but thick, curling black smoke seeping out of the seams where the lavatory walls met. The unmistakable signature of a fire burning inside the structure itself, behind the panels, where he could not get at it. He grabbed a carbon dioxide fire extinguisher and emptied it into the lavatory anyway. It could not reach the fire because the fire was not in the lavatory, it was in the wall. This distinction between a fire in the lavatory and a fire behind it was the hinge on which the whole tragedy would turn, and the crew, doing their honest best in a chaos of smoke and half-glimpsed information, never quite managed to communicate it clearly to the one man who most needed to understand it. At 7:02, Laura Kayama went to the cockpit and told the pilots there was a fire in the washroom. Cameron pulled on his oxygen mask and sent Ouimet back to investigate. Ouimet made his way aft, but the smoke was already so thick in the last few rows that he could not even reach the lavatory. Benetti told him what he had seen, that he had not found the source of the fire, that he had doused the lavatory, and, crucially, that he did not think it was a simple fire in the trash bin. That last detail mattered enormously. A fire in a waste bin is a small, contained, easily managed thing. A fire of unknown origin spreading behind the walls is a mortal emergency demanding an immediate landing. But when Ouimet returned to the cockpit and reported to Cameron, he passed along the smoke and his own suggestion that they ought to descend, and left out Benetti's warning that this was no mere bin fire. And then the information got worse, not better. Moments later, Benetti himself came forward and told the captain that the smoke seemed to be easing up. A little after that, he reported again that it seemed to be clearing. To Cameron, sitting in the cockpit with his oxygen mask on, unable to see the back of his own airplane, the picture these reports painted was a reassuring one. A fire in a lavatory trash bin, sprayed with an extinguisher, now dying down. It was exactly the kind of minor event that did not require the drastic, difficult step of an emergency descent from 33,000 feet. And so, for a few more precious minutes, Cameron did not descend. He was not being reckless. He was acting on the information he had. Information that was, through no single person's fault, catastrophically wrong. The smoke was not easing because the fire was going out. It was easing, briefly, because the fire had consumed the readily available oxygen in the enclosed rear of the cabin, and was now feeding, hungrily and invisibly, on the airplane itself. The airplane told the truth before the people did. Shortly after Benetti's reassurances, a warning light glowed on the cockpit panel. The master caution signaling a loss of main electrical power. The fire, burning through the bundles of wiring in the rear of the aircraft, had begun to sever the airplane's nervous system. Cameron radioed the air traffic controllers in Indianapolis to report an electrical problem, and moments later the airplane's transponder, the device that reports its identity and altitude to radar, went dead, forcing controllers to track the flight as a bare blip on their screens. By now, Ouimet had gone aft one more time, and this time he did not need anyone to interpret what he found. He reached out to open the lavatory door and felt that it was hot to the touch, the sign of a serious growing fire on the other side. He told the flight attendants to keep it shut and hurried back to the cockpit. "I don't like what's happening," he told Cameron. "I think we better go down, okay?" There was an urgency in his voice that the captain had not heard before, and Cameron understood at once that the time for waiting was over. But the airplane was already dying around them. Just as Ouimet returned, a second warning lit up, the master warning, indicating the loss of the emergency electrical power as well. The fire had now burned through so much of the wiring that the DC-9 was losing systems in cascade. Most critically, the electrical power to the horizontal stabilizer, the movable surface at the tail that controls the airplane's pitch, its nose-up and nose-down attitude, failed, and the stabilizer froze in the position set for level cruise. From this moment on, Cameron and Ouimet would have to fly the airplane and bring it down thousands of feet to a landing, without one of the primary controls for doing so, muscling the descent through brute force on the control columns. And at almost the same instant, both the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, the two black boxes that had been faithfully documenting the disaster, lost power and stopped. Everything that happened after this point would have to be reconstructed from the memories of the survivors and the wreckage on the ground. At 7:08, Captain Cameron pushed the nose down, and into his radio he spoke the word that turns every controller's blood cold. "Mayday, mayday, mayday." The controllers cleared him immediately to divert to the greater Cincinnati airport, in the Kentucky hills across the river from the city, and began the delicate work of guiding a crippled airplane to the ground. Because so many of the flight's instruments were dead, Cameron could not fly a normal approach. Instead, the controllers used what is called a no-gyro approach, watching the airplane on their radar and telling the pilots when to start and stop each turn, talking them down like a voice in the dark. Inside, conditions were becoming hellish. Smoke poured forward through the cabin and began seeping into the cockpit, so that the pilots were flying half-blind, their eyes stinging, their world reduced to the instruments they could still read and the controller's voice in their ears. The public address system had failed, leaving the flight attendants unable to shout instructions to the passengers over the noise. And yet, in the middle of this, the three of them did something remarkable, something that was not standard practice on airliners in 1983, and that they improvised out of sheer good sense. They moved every passenger forward, away from the smoke, and toward the exits, herding them ahead of row 13. And they went to the passengers seated beside the emergency exits over the wings and taught them, then and there, how to open the doors, a briefing that airlines did not routinely give, and that would, in a matter of minutes, save lives. In the back of a burning airplane, choking on smoke, with no way to address the cabin, 3 flight attendants were quietly building the machinery of their passengers' survival. In the cockpit, meanwhile, the 2 pilots were engaged in a fight that has few equals in the annals of airmanship, with the horizontal stabilizer frozen and much of the instrumentation dead. Cameron was flying an airplane that no longer wanted to be flown, controlling its pitch by sheer muscle on the control column, while the smoke thickened around him and the controller's voice guided each turn. He had no artificial horizon he could fully trust, no normal path down, and no room for error, a stricken airplane bleeding altitude toward the Kentucky hills, flown by 2 men who could barely see their own panel, talked down by a controller watching a blip. Every decision had to be right the first time, because there would be no second approach, that the airplane arrived over the runway at all, lined up, wings level, in a condition to land, was the product of a coordination between cockpit and control tower, and between the 2 pilots themselves, that had to be very nearly perfect, under conditions that were very nearly impossible. At 20 minutes past 7, just 17 minutes after the first report of fire reached the cockpit, though it must have felt like hours, Captain Cameron and First Officer Iwamet brought Air Canada Flight 797 down onto the runway at Cincinnati. It was, by every account, an extraordinary piece of flying. A heavy jet, brought down from cruising altitude and landed by 2 exhausted men fighting blinding smoke and a frozen pitch control, using a technique of last resort. The landing was hard enough to blow out 4 of the airplane's tires. But the DC-9 stayed on the runway and rolled to a stop, and for one suspended moment, it seemed that against all odds they had made it. The airplane was on the ground, it was intact. The fire, however terrible, was survivable now. All that remained was to get everyone out, and that is where the cruelest turn of this whole cruel story occurred. The instant the airplane stopped, the chief flight attendant threw open the forward door, and the crew and passengers began to escape, out the front doors, where the evacuation slides deployed, and out the emergency exits over the wings, which the passengers who had just been briefed now opened for themselves. The 3 flight attendants got out. 18 of the 41 passengers got out. But opening those doors did the one thing that a cabin full of superheated, smoke-choked, oxygen-starved air must never be allowed to do. It let in fresh air. For long minutes the fire had been smoldering in an enclosed space, hot beyond imagining, but starved of the oxygen it needed to burst into open flame. Now, with the doors flung wide, that oxygen came flooding in. Less than 90 seconds after the wheels touched the runway, the entire interior of the cabin exploded into fire in a single instant, a phenomenon firefighters call a flashover, or a backdraft, turning the inside of the airplane into a furnace. Everyone who was still aboard died. To grasp how this could happen, how an airplane that had just survived could kill in seconds, you have to understand what fire needs. A fire requires 3 things: fuel, heat, and oxygen. For long minutes, the fire aboard Flight 797 had had fuel in abundance in the plastics and foams of the cabin, and it had heat beyond measure. What it had been running short of was oxygen, sealed as it was inside a closed fuselage where the flames had already burned up much of the available air. The whole cabin had become a superheated chamber, packed with hot, unburned, flammable gases given off by the smoldering materials, wanting only one thing to become an inferno. When the doors opened, they delivered that one thing. Fresh air rushed into a space primed to ignite, and the result was not a fire that spread, but a fire that arrived everywhere at once, a wave of flame that swept the cabin in a heartbeat. This is why the timing was so merciless. The very act of opening the airplane to save the people inside was what doomed the ones who had not yet gotten out. There was no slow-rising danger to outrun. There was survivable. And then, 90 seconds later, there was not. 23 passengers did not get out. They died of smoke inhalation and burns, most of them in the forward half of the cabin, between the wings and the cockpit, the very place they had been moved to for safety, now cut off from the exits by the wall of fire that erupted behind them. Some were found in the aisle, some still in their seats. The margin between living and dying had come down to seconds and to luck. One survivor, Diane Fadley, would later describe the terrible arbitrariness of it in words that have haunted the accident ever since. "It was almost," she said, "as though anybody who got out had nothing wrong with them at all. You made it, and you were completely fine, or you didn't make it. There was no in-between. The flashover did not wound. It simply divided the living from the dead." In the cockpit, the two pilots had done everything they could and had almost not gotten out themselves. Unable to enter the cabin because of the smoke and the heat, Ouimet forced open his side window and climbed out. Cameron tried to follow, but he was utterly spent. He had just flown a crippled airliner to the ground by main strength, and he sagged in his seat, barely conscious, unable to move. He might have died there. In the seat of the airplane he had just saved so many people from, had firefighters outside not sprayed foam through the open window and jolted him back to awareness. Roused, he managed to open his own escape window and drop to the ground, where Ouimet dragged him clear. Captain Donald Cameron was the last living person to leave Air Canada Flight 797. Years later, asked about the people he had not been able to save, he said simply that he had done the best he could, and that he was sorry the ones who didn't get off, because they had spent so much time and effort getting them there. It is the voice of a man who brought an airplane out of the sky through sheer will and still carries the 23 he could not carry all the way home. The investigation that followed had at least the black boxes to work with. Though the fire had gutted the fuselage, both recorders were recovered in good condition, and it was they that revealed the 8 sounds of electrical arcing that had begun before anyone noticed anything wrong. The fire's first silent signature, inaudible to the crew over the noise of flight. Investigators found wires in the rear of the airplane with their insulation burned or stripped away, but they faced an impossible puzzle. They could not tell whether that damage had caused the fire or had been caused by it. They examined the old splices from the decompression repair 4 years earlier and found no evidence of arcing there. In the end, after exhaustive work, the National Transportation Safety Board was forced to admit that it could not determine the origin of the fire. It knew where the fire had been. It had propagated through the left rear lavatory area, but the spark that started it was lost forever in the ashes. What the investigators could establish, in grim detail, was how the people had died, and the answer indicted not the crew but the airplane itself. Blood samples from the victims showed high levels of hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide, the poisons given off by burning cabin materials. The plastics and foams and fabrics that lined the DC-9 had not merely burned. They had, in burning, filled the cabin with toxic gas. The airplane had helped kill its own passengers, and it had done so because no one had ever required it to be built any other way. And then the safety board did something that turned this tragedy bitter for the very men who had saved so many lives. In its first report, issued in the summer of 1984, the board praised Captain Cameron for outstanding airmanship, stating plainly that without his skill, everyone on board would have died. But it also concluded that the accident's severity had been worsened by the flight crew's delayed decision to begin an emergency descent. In other words, the same report that credited the captain with saving the airplane also faulted him for not saving it sooner. To the pilots' community, this was infuriating, and not without reason. It is easy, sitting in a quiet room 2 years later, with a complete transcript and all the facts laid out, to see that the crew should have descended the moment smoke appeared. It was a great deal harder in the cockpit of Flight 797, receiving a stream of reports that described a small lavatory fire that seemed to be going out. First Officer Ouimet wrote the board a detailed, impassioned defense of the crew's decisions, pointing out, among much else, that the nearest airport when they first recognized the emergency, Louisville, had been too close to descend too safely from cruising altitude, and that reaching Cincinnati at all had been a near-run thing given the loss of the stabilizer. Pilots and airline people petitioned the board to reconsider, and in 1986 the board did. It issued a revised report that incorporated Alamet's explanation of the landing decision, softened its language from conflicting to misleading information, an acknowledgement that the crew had been actively misled by the reports they received, and, tellingly, removed the word delayed from its finding, replacing it with the more neutral observation that the time taken to evaluate the fire and decide to descend had contributed to the accident. It was a small change in wording, but a significant change in blame. The debate itself, as one chronicler of the accident later observed, was very much a product of its time. To a modern pilot, trained in an era when the mere word fire sends a crew diving for the nearest runway, the instinct to land immediately seems obvious, but that modern instinct exists in large part because of accidents exactly like this one. The crew of Flight 797 were being judged, in a sense, against lessons their own tragedy would teach. Their peers understood this perfectly and honored them for it. Both pilots received their profession's awards for superior airmanship, and the crew were recognized by Canadian aviation organizations for what they had done. They had not failed. They had been ahead of their equipment and behind only the knowledge that did not yet exist. Among the 23 who did not walk away from the runway at Cincinnati was Stan Rogers, and it is worth pausing on him, because his death is the reason so many people who know nothing else about aviation safety know the name of this flight. Rogers was, at 33, at the height of his powers, a towering figure, literally and musically, whose booming baritone and vivid plain-spoken songs had made him one of the defining voices of the Canadian folk revival. He wrote about fishermen and privateers and the Northwest Passage, about ordinary people and hard work in the sea, and he wrote one song in particular, The Mary Ellen Carter, about a sunken ship raised by the stubborn refusal of its crew to let it stay down, that has become an anthem of perseverance, sung by sailors and soldiers and survivors ever since, a song about rising again from disaster that its author did not himself survive. That a man who wrote so movingly about the will to live should die of smoke inhalation on a runway, having very nearly made it out, is a cruelty that no accident report can capture. His songs are still sung today, at kitchen tables and folk festivals across Canada and far beyond, and every time they carry a faint echo of Flight 797, a song of smoke and fire, in the end, that outlived the fire that silenced its singer. Here is where the story turns from tragedy toward something that, if not redemption, is at least meaning. Because the safety board understood, even as it argued over the crew's timing, that the deeper lesson of Flight 797 had nothing to do with when the pilots descended. The deeper lesson was that a routine airliner in 1983 was catastrophically unprepared for fire, and that this could and must be fixed. And so, out of this accident, came one of the most important waves of safety reform the industry has ever seen. The changes came quickly, and they were sweeping. Airliners were required to install smoke detectors in their lavatories, so that a fire smoldering in that enclosed space, exactly as it had on Flight 797, would announce itself immediately, instead of growing in secret until it was too large to fight. Automatic fire extinguishers were required in the lavatory waste bins to snuff out a trash fire the instant it started, without anyone needing to notice it at all. The flammable seat cushions that had fed the fire and poisoned the air were required to be wrapped in fire-blocking materials, dramatically slowing the spread of any cabin fire and buying passengers precious seconds. Lights were mandated along the floor of the cabin, low enough to stay visible beneath a ceiling of smoke, marking a glowing path to the exits for passengers who could no longer see the signs above their heads. Better fire extinguishers, using more effective agents, were put in the hands of better-trained crews, and in a change that reached beyond fire alone, regulators tightened the rules on evacuation itself. Manufacturers were now required to prove that a full airplane could be emptied in 90 seconds. The very margin that had separated the living from the dead on Flight 797, and the practice that Flight 797's own flight attendants had improvised in desperation. of briefing the passengers in the overwing exit rows on how to open the doors became standard across the industry. The things that 3 flight attendants had invented on the spot to save their passengers were written into the law that protects all of us. There were subtler changes, too, each one traceable to a specific failure of that night. The handheld extinguishers carried in the cabin were upgraded to more capable agents, able to fight the kind of hidden, stubborn fire the crew of 797 could not reach. Tactile markings were added to the overhead bins to help passengers find the exit rows by touch when smoke robbed them of sight. Crew firefighting training was overhauled and would eventually be built around a hard new doctrine that Flight 797, more than almost any other accident, helped establish: that in the case of smoke or fire of unknown origin, a crew does not diagnose and deliberate. It gets the airplane on the ground at the nearest suitable airport, immediately, because the clock is always running and the fire always wins a waiting game. The modern pilot's reflex to dive for the nearest runway at the first whiff of smoke, the reflex whose absence the safety board had criticized in 1983, is in no small part the direct inheritance of this flight. What had been a matter of individual judgment became a matter of trained instinct, precisely so that no future crew would be misled, as this one had been, into believing they had more time than they did. None of it would have brought back the 23. But the cabin you sit in today, the next time you fly, is a fundamentally safer place than the cabin of Flight 797, and it is safer in specific, traceable ways. The detector in the lavatory, the extinguisher in the bin, the fire-blocked cushion beneath you, the strip of lights along the aisle floor, the 90-second promise, the briefing given to the person by the overwing exit. Because of what happened over Kentucky on a June evening in 1983, fires still start on airplanes, but because of Flight 797 and the reforms it forced, they almost never again become what they became that night. It is tempting, with a fire of undetermined origin, to feel that the story has no villain and therefore no lesson, that it was simply bad luck, a spark in an old wire that no one could have prevented. But that is exactly the wrong lesson to draw, and the industry, to its credit, did not draw it. The spark may have been unpreventable. Everything that turned that spark into 23 deaths was not. The fire spread the way it did, because the airplane was full of things that burn. It went undetected because there was nothing built to detect it. It killed with poison gas because no one had required the materials to be less toxic. And when the doors finally opened onto salvation, the cabin flashed over because it had been allowed to become an oven full of fuel. Each of those was a choice about how to build an airplane, made long before Flight 797 ever left Dallas, and each of them was unchosen, afterward by people determined that the next fire would not find the next airplane so defenseless. 23 people did not come home from a routine flight to Montreal on a June evening in 1983, among them a singer whose songs about the refusal to surrender are still sung wherever people need them. They were failed not by their crew, who fought with everything they had and were honored for it, but by an airplane and an industry that had never taken seriously the one emergency every pilot fears most. Their deaths bought the smoke detector in the lavatory, the light on the floor, the fire-blocked seat, the 90-second rule, the quiet, invisible architecture of survival that surrounds every passenger who flies today, and that almost none of them will ever know is there. That is the strange grace of this most graceless of tragedies, that a fire no one could explain, in an airplane no one had thought to protect, became the reason that the airplanes which followed would be built to save us, in memory of the 23.